It was raining lightly when we pulled up to the Glass Bridge Pavilion, and there was something poetic about that. The way the drizzle softened the lights above the marble entrance, the way it blurred the judgment I already knew was waiting inside. My daughter Noelle's 16th birthday was being celebrated in the kind of venue people booked a year in advance, with linen napkins pressed like origami and ice sculptures that existed just long enough to remind you how cold a place could be. I stayed in the car, not because I was hesitant, but because I knew exactly what waited for me beyond those glass doors. Talia, my fiancée, reached across the console and placed her hand over mine. It was warm, steady, sure. That was Talia in every sense, never one to flinch. Her touch didn't ask questions, it simply understood. We didn't need to talk about it again. I wasn't officially invited, and we both knew why. Helene, my ex-wife, had made her stance clear months ago. No plus ones. No disruptions. No outside energy. She said it with that smug curl in her lip she always wore when she felt power tilt in her favor. Her new husband, Martin Vexley, didn't bother with subtleties. When Noelle, bless her brave heart, asked if her dad could bring someone, Martin had laughed. Not kindly, not the sort of laugh that leaves room for dignity. No plus ones for the help, he said, standing in his pristine foyer like he was auditioning for a billionaire villain role he already believed he'd earned. The help. That was me in his eyes, someone who'd failed to climb fast enough, who didn't speak the language of venture capital or designer shoes or destination galas. Martin didn't like people he couldn't control, and I wasn't his employee or his sycophant. That made me a threat. But this wasn't about him. It wasn't about Helene either. It was about Noelle, my daughter, 16 today. I remembered when she was 6, drawing rainbows with both hands like her imagination couldn't keep up with her fingers. She used to say I was her favorite color, somewhere between blue and gold. She didn't always say it aloud anymore, but the way her texts came in late at night, the way she asked if I'd be there tonight despite the rules, told me she still meant it. I was going to show up for her. I always did. The Civic's engine ticked quietly as we sat under the rain-speckled awning. I watched a stream of luxury cars pull in: Bentleys, Range Rovers, one Lamborghini that stalled briefly because its driver forgot it wasn't built for subtlety. The valets rushed, umbrellas snapped open and closed, and laughter drifted from the covered walkway like it was floating above real life. Talia looked effortlessly elegant, even seated. Her dress was a deep green that pulled the gold from her skin and the power from any room. She didn't wear statement jewelry. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. "You sure you want to do this?" I asked, not because I doubted her, but because I needed to offer her an out. The rain had made everything feel quieter, like the world was holding its breath. She smiled. "You're the one who's unsure. I go where you go. We're not here to ask permission." And that was why I loved her. Not for her money, not for her title, not even for how she managed to calm every storm inside me with nothing more than a look, but because she never treated me like a guest in my own life. Talia never saw me as the man who didn't make it. She saw me as the man who hadn't quit. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out the card Noelle had slipped into my jacket the night before. It was small, handwritten, folded into quarters. "Please come, Dad. Even if Mom says otherwise. It won't feel like my birthday if you're not there." That was all I needed. I opened the door into the misty air, and Talia followed, heels clicking lightly against the pavement. We walked toward the entrance slowly, not to delay but to let the moment unfold. I could already feel the eyes from the valet stand. Recognition. Uncertainty. The man nearest the podium stepped forward, his uniform pristine, his hair wet at the edges from guiding umbrellas all evening. "Sir," he said cautiously, "are you here for the Vexley event?" His tone was respectful, but I heard the subtext. "Do you belong here?" Before I could respond, Talia moved just one step ahead of me, the rain brushing her shoulders like it wasn't brave enough to land properly. Another valet behind us caught sight of her, and his entire demeanor shifted like someone had flipped a switch. He straightened. "Madam Chairman," he said, bowing slightly, "shall we park your Bentley in your reserved spot?" I didn't even have to look to know that Helene had arrived at the door at that exact moment. That's how these nights were scripted. Timing always betrayed the people who thought they controlled the room. Helene's mouth fell open. Her jaw twitched just once, the way it used to when she saw something she couldn't quite control. She looked stunning, as always, her dress a high-neck designer piece in ice blue. Cold and expensive, like everything she valued. Her eyes flicked from me to Talia like she was trying to calculate whether this was a scene or a scandal. "You brought her," she spat, ignoring every rule of decorum she pretended to value. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded once and replied, "You mean the woman who owns this building?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of every assumption they'd ever made about me. Full of every conversation I hadn't been invited to. And for once, I didn't feel small. I felt inevitable. Talia didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply reached for my hand again, the way she had in the car. A quiet statement, nothing performative. We weren't there to make a scene. We were there because a 16-year-old girl with more heart than most adults wanted her father at her birthday. And I wasn't about to disappoint her. The rain had picked up just enough to patter steadily against the hood of my coat when I stepped out, but I welcomed it. Let it soak in. Let it chill my skin. It was grounding, honest. Unlike the polished tension wrapped inside the Glassbridge Pavilion, the rain didn't pretend. It didn't care about tuxedos or last names stitched into seating charts. It didn't blink twice when it landed on silk or sentiment. I stood there beside Talia, the drizzle dampening the edge of her coat, and I breathed in deep before we crossed that final step to the entrance. It wasn't hesitation. It was acknowledgement. This was a turning point. We hadn't even made it to the welcome easel before a valet jogged toward us, holding a black umbrella like a flag of uncertain diplomacy. He was young, maybe 19, 20 at most, and squinting through the rain to match my face with the name in his head. "Sir," he asked, voice careful, "are you here for the Vexley event?" I gave a polite nod, more out of instinct than anything. I could see the question circling behind his eyes, but he didn't get the chance to ask it. Behind me, footsteps splashed through the puddles with an expensive rhythm, heels made for clicking across marble, not concrete. I turned in time to see her, Helene's newest ally, the woman she played brunch politics with and booked spa retreats to maintain that sheen of dominance. I didn't recognize her by name at first, only by presence. But then the valet saw her too, and everything about him shifted. "Madam Chairman," he said with reverence, snapping upright, "shall we park your Bentley in your reserved spot?" The young man moved with the urgency of someone who understood that tips came in more than currency, they came in influence. But the sound of his voice and the unmistakable address rippled outward like a dropped stone in still water. The few people hovering near the doors, ushers, servers, and two parents still arguing over the party favors, turned. Heads pivoted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Helene was at the door already, just inside the canopy, under the glow of golden chandeliers that framed her like a magazine spread. Her jaw twitched again. I had seen it twitch in court, when the custody judge called my apartment stable and child-centered. I had seen it twitch when Noelle had told her she preferred my Sunday breakfasts over Martin's motivational talks. And I saw it now, pulsing with disbelief, as her eyes locked on Talia and refused to let go. "You brought her." Helene's voice was sharp and too loud, the kind that echoed just enough to guarantee ears turned. She took one step closer, her designer heels not quite masking the fury behind the calculated posture. The valet hesitated, eyes darting between the women like he had suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of a battlefield. Talia didn't blink. She turned just slightly, enough to let the rain cast a shine on her cheekbones. "You mean the woman who owns this building?" I said it quietly, but not softly. The kind of tone that didn't need volume because the weight of truth carried it forward like thunder behind glass. Helene's lips parted, then closed. She didn't have a retort ready. That in itself was a small miracle. Her entire world was built on narrative, curated, sculpted, spun. But this moment, she hadn't rehearsed for it. She hadn't imagined a world where I showed up, not just supported, but with someone who didn't need the party, someone the party needed. The valet, now visibly nervous, straightened again and tried to recover. "Would you prefer the Aston or the Bentley pulled to the front, madam?" His voice cracked slightly under the pressure of proximity to power. Talia, ever gracious, gave him a half-smile. "We'll be brief. Just make sure my assistant has the Bentley keys by 10. We won't be taking long." She glanced at me, then back to the entrance. "Unless your team needs anything else parked?" Her question was rhetorical, but the silence it created had a shape, a texture. People were listening now. Not just looking. Listening. Behind Helene, Martin appeared. He wore that same smug half-smile he always did, as if every room belonged to him the moment he walked into it. He took one look at Talia and nearly choked on his own smugness. His eyes flicked over her face like he couldn't believe she was real, like some celebrity AI simulation had glitched into his stepdaughter's birthday. "Talia Pierce," he said with a forced charm that barely covered the crack in his pride. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." She didn't bother offering him a handshake. "I wasn't planning to be here," she said. But then someone reminded me that family matters more than invitations. Martin's smile wobbled just enough for me to see the truth behind it: panic. Because this wasn't just a social faux pas. This was exposure. Everyone knew Talia. They just never knew she'd walk into their world from my side of the aisle. Martin had spent the last 3 years posturing in Helene's shadow, telling anyone who would listen that I was the past, that Noelle's real future belonged in his boardrooms, not my kitchen. But now the man who didn't belong was standing next to the one woman whose tech empire could buy and sell Martin's portfolio without blinking. I could feel the narrative cracking beneath them. I could feel the shift. Talia leaned in toward me slightly, her voice a whisper for me alone. "They don't even know they've lost the room yet." She was right. They were still clinging to an old story, unaware that the rain had already washed the ink from its pages. We stepped forward together, toward the doors, the entrance widening as though the building itself recognized who it belonged to. I reached for the handle, not out of defiance, but out of habit. Talia caught it first. "Tonight, let me open the door," she said, smiling, not to the crowd, but to me. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about partnership. And in that moment, I realized how foreign that feeling had become in my life. Someone walking beside me, not ahead, not behind, but with. As the doors swung open, the scent of gardenias and imported linen met us. Light spilled out, warm and expectant. People turned. Conversations paused mid-toast. In that brief beat between rain and recognition, I saw it clearly. What Helene had feared, what Martin had failed to account for, what the valets and whispering guests had just begun to understand. I wasn't just the man standing in the rain anymore. I was the man who came back in with the storm. Talia walked a half step ahead of me as we entered the ballroom, and it didn't take long for the temperature of the room to shift. You could feel it in the way heads turned mid-conversation, in the way champagne glasses paused midair, frozen between sip and suspicion. It was as if someone had cut the string of a carefully tuned performance, and suddenly the background music of gossip and networking stuttered to a halt. I kept my pace even, my expression calm, but inside I could feel the pulse of every eye calculating, guessing, remembering. That's what happens when the woman walking beside you isn't just a guest. She's the unspoken name that lives on headlines, the unseen hand behind boards and buyouts, the kind of woman people read about but never expect to see at a 16-year-old's birthday party in suburban Connecticut. Everyone knew Talia as elegant, quiet, and understated. They saw her grace and assumed it was the whole story. But that was the mistake people always made with her, confusing composure with permission, misreading poise for passivity. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to learn, was that Talia Pierce didn't attend events like this because she didn't need to. She had no interest in being invited to circles that would have tried to revolve around her anyway. But tonight? Tonight wasn't about image or dominance. It was about Noelle. It was about me. And that made it personal. The room, opulent as expected, had been dressed within an inch of its life. Silver and lavender everywhere, floral arrangements that stretched past centerpieces and into ego territory. The glass chandeliers shimmered in harmony with the piano medley from the corner stage, but the music couldn't disguise the whispers now gaining speed. They were coming faster, overlapping like gossip in a school hallway. Is that really Talia Pierce? Oh my God, the AI woman? Isn't that the Linares Systems CEO? Wait, he's dating her? I thought Helene said he worked in retail. We passed a trio of mothers I vaguely recognized from past parent nights. Women who had spent the last few years barely offering polite nods, always busy shielding their husbands from imagined contagion. Now they stared at me like I'd risen from some forgotten depth with treasure clutched in both hands. One of them actually smiled, big and bright and sudden, like we'd been friends all along. Talia noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she didn't respond. She never needed to. Her presence was a response. The valet inside announced her name to one of the coordinators, probably to confirm table placement, but he didn't say it like it was just a name. He said it the way someone says a weather forecast before a flood. "Miss Pierce, welcome." His voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying nerves that his tailored vest couldn't hide. Would you prefer the Aston or the Bentley pulled up when you're ready to depart? Another ripple through the guests. Another line in the air, drawn clearly between those who had underestimated and those now scrambling to recover. And then, Martin. He had stationed himself near the bar, all faux confidence and clean lines in his designer suit. When he saw us, his eyes widened just enough to betray panic before he forced it back into the half-smile he always wore, the one that said he still believed the room was his. He approached like a politician mid-scandal, all charm and calculation. "Talia Pierce," he said, holding out his hand like he expected her to fall for the illusion of formality. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Talia looked at his hand, then at his face, and didn't move. "Clearly," she said with a gentle smile, one that held just enough chill to crack porcelain. She didn't have to mention that Martin had once emailed her twice, actually begging for a spot on the Linares advisory board. He hadn't even gotten a reply. I remembered her saying, "He reminds me of a man who watches a parade and thinks it's for him." That same man now stood 3 feet in front of her, trying to control the narrative with a handshake. Martin retracted his hand slowly, trying not to look like he'd been dismissed. "You here for the tech panel or the after-party?" he asked, desperate to spin. "Actually," she said, her eyes sliding to me, "I'm here for the father of the birthday girl." She said it clearly, not loudly, but clearly enough. That sentence alone rewrote the entire evening for half the people within earshot. He wasn't just a guest. He wasn't just the ex. He wasn't just the help. He was standing beside the woman who owned more equity than the rest of the room combined, and they were together. Martin chuckled nervously. "Well, we're all just here to support Noelle. Beautiful night, isn't it?" He glanced toward the photographer, probably hoping for a shot that would flatten the humiliation. But Talia didn't give him the out. "It is," she said, despite the weather and the reception. Just then, Helene appeared again. She had changed from ice queen to hostess mask, her smile now so tight it looked surgically applied. "Talia," she said, with a voice she'd clearly practiced. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't expecting such a surprise." She glanced at me, then back to Talia, hoping to find some crack in the surface. Talia tilted her head ever so slightly. "Helene, do you often insult guests before they walk in, or only when you're standing in a building you don't own?" Her tone never changed. Polite. Even. Devastating. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was historic. I saw at least 3 people pretend to check their phones, just to have an excuse not to meet anyone's eyes. A waiter who had just arrived with a tray of mocktails turned back around, pretending to forget where he was headed. I could feel the air tighten around Martin and Helene. Their power, once so assured, was bleeding out with every word Talia spoke. And all I had to do was stand there. I wasn't sweating. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to. The whispers didn't stop as we moved deeper into the room. They evolved into recalculations, rewrites, regrets. Every person who had looked through me before now looked at me like they'd missed something crucial. And maybe they had. Maybe the mistake they made wasn't underestimating me. Maybe it was assuming my story ended the moment Helene shut the door on it. But now, with Talia's hand resting on my arm and the room swirling around us in stunned silence, it was clear. My story hadn't ended. It had just started a new chapter, with her walking beside me. The ballroom lighting was soft but revealing. The kind designed to flatter evening gowns and expensive haircuts, not the expressions of people caught off guard. As Talia and I walked further in, the murmurs transformed into full-on side conversations. Faces I hadn't seen in years were suddenly turning my way, their smiles landing late and artificial, like someone had just reminded them I was someone they were supposed to recognize. And maybe for the first time, they actually did. I'd been coming to these school events, birthdays, and benefit galas for years. Always quiet, always courteous, always tolerated. Helene used to say I should be grateful to be included, as if parenting Noelle meant showing up without making ripples. I was supposed to blend into the marble, stay near the walls, shake hands with the other fathers, and nod at their business chatter like I didn't have opinions of my own. They'd ask about my work like it was a trivia game, not a life. Still doing that freelance thing? What exactly is it you consult for again? Every conversation was a careful reminder that I didn't belong. Until tonight. The whispers had texture now. Panic in some, envy in others, disbelief wrapped in forced politeness. I caught snatches as we walked toward the center of the room. She's here with him? Did you hear what Martin called him outside? No way, that's the same guy Helene divorced. He looks different. That's Talia Pierce, right? I'd been a background figure in their narrative so long, they didn't know how to adjust the script with me front and center. Talia didn't acknowledge a single whisper. She held her chin steady, her presence like gravity. And yet, she wasn't trying to dominate the room. That's what made the shift so disorienting for everyone else. She wasn't playing the game. She simply showed up as herself, and the room realigned around her, like it always does when someone walks in with nothing to prove. Martin was pacing by the far wine station now, jaw tight, forehead glistening just enough to betray the pressure building behind his carefully combed hairline. He kept trying to draw people into conversation, waving a hand or tilting his head with manufactured ease. But the energy had moved. It wasn't orbiting him anymore. It was swirling around the woman he once tried to network his way into favor with and the man he called to help less than an hour ago. Helene, meanwhile, had drifted into the corner with her sister and a few of the PDA types who ran every event like a silent boardroom. She tried to laugh too loudly at something, her head thrown back at the wrong angle, as if overacting could override the fact that she looked like she'd been blindsided. And she had. She hadn't just lost control of the party. She'd lost control of the room's narrative. Talia and I weren't meant to show up like this. We weren't supposed to belong. But there we were. Helene, Talia said, her voice like fine crystal being set on marble, controlled, resonant, impossible to ignore. Do you often insult guests before they walk in? Or only when you're standing in a building you don't own? The words weren't loud, but they traveled. The women around Helene stiffened, their lips tightening as they pretended not to hear. But I saw the tremor ripple through the group like an earthquake that hadn't fully arrived yet. Helene blinked slowly, her mouth twitching towards some reply she couldn't quite conjure. "This is my daughter's birthday," she said, voice sharp and tight. "Not a press conference." "Exactly," Talia said, calm. "Which is why I walked in quietly, smiled politely, and haven't said a word until now." "But you made it loud, Helene." "Not me." A hush followed, thick and undeniable. Even the pianist faltered, fingers pausing before picking back up again. Across the room, I saw a man I once begged for job leads suddenly look down at his drink like it had started to judge him. Another father gave me a sheepish nod, the kind that said, "I didn't know. I just followed the crowd." And there it was. The implosion. Not explosive. Not chaotic. Just quiet enough to be irreversible. The social circle Helene had built like a fortress began to crack, not with shouts or slammed glasses, but with realization. The realization that the man they had laughed off was standing taller than ever, and the woman beside him wasn't here to make waves. She was the tide. Martin stepped in again, trying to patch what he didn't know had already fallen apart. "Let's all enjoy the evening, shall we?" he said with that polished grin tone that had probably worked in 100 conference rooms. "This is about Noelle, after all." He looked at Talia like he expected her to nod, to ease the tension. But she didn't. She glanced at me instead. "It's always been about Noelle," I said, finally speaking into the silence. "That's why I'm here. She asked me to be. I showed up like I always do." And with that, we moved past them. Past Helene's throne of false certainty. Past Martin's synthetic charm. Past the circle that had spent so long closing in around itself it forgot the outside existed. Talia guided us toward the back patio doors where the garden lights twinkled, and a few teens gathered for photos. Her hand found mine again, not as a statement this time, but as something quieter. "Steady. You okay?" she asked, voice low enough for only me. "Better than okay," I said. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm not the one who needs to explain himself. "You never were," she replied. "They just made you believe you had to." We stood for a moment at the edge of the party, where laughter still bubbled among Noelle's friends and the sky was beginning to clear outside. I looked back at the room, not out of longing, not out of regret, but because I needed to see it one last time from this new perspective. The place that had once made me feel small had now made its mistake visible in the light. And Talia? She hadn't come to rescue me. She had simply stood beside me while I reclaimed what had always been mine, the right to take up space. I didn't see her at first. The ballroom was still buzzing with the aftershock of what had just unfolded near the entrance. Too many people pretending to sip from already empty glasses, whispering behind menus and floral arrangements like the scent of scandal was more intoxicating than the wine. But then I heard it. A voice, clear, surprised, and so achingly familiar that it sliced through every other sound like it was made just for me. Dad, Noelle. She stood near the dessert table, a lavender sash tied around her waist, the number 16 sparkling in silver glitter on her birthday tiara. Her mouth opened slightly in disbelief, her eyes wide, not with embarrassment or frustration, but something softer. Hope, relief. That moment where a child recognizes that someone they still trust has shown up, despite the odds, despite the noise, despite everything. I didn't say a word right away. I just smiled. Not the guarded, polite kind I'd grown used to offering in rooms like this, but the one I reserved for her. The one I hadn't been able to give her freely since Helene started rewriting what co-parenting meant into whatever suited her that week. And then Noelle did something that no amount of planning or posturing from Helene or Martin could have accounted for. She ran to me. Not dainty steps. Not a controlled, calculated walk like her mother would have preferred. No, she sprinted across the floor, dress swishing, heels clicking unevenly, arms already stretching forward. She crashed into me with the kind of hug that people spend their lives chasing. Tight, full of questions, full of answers. I wrapped my arms around her, rein still clinging to the shoulders of my coat, and I didn't care who saw. Not the socialites, not the power brokers, not the photographers hired to make it all look curated. You came, she whispered into my chest, her voice muffled but trembling. Of course I did, I said, pulling back just enough to see her face. You asked me to. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to play it cool again, but I saw the shimmer there. The proof that she'd doubted I would. Or maybe she doubted they'd let me. I glanced over her shoulder to where Helene stood now, frozen mid-sip of her flute, jaw tight. Martin was trying not to look angry. Or maybe just trying not to look irrelevant. I got your note, I said softly. You folded it into my jacket pocket like you were sneaking contraband. She gave a little laugh and shook her head. I wasn't sure Mom would follow through. She said you were too busy, that your new life didn't have time for all this. I knelt slightly, lowering my voice. Sweetheart, I'll always make time for you. My new life doesn't replace you. It includes you. You're not something I left behind. You're the reason I keep moving forward. She smiled again, smaller this time, more thoughtful. Then her eyes flicked past my shoulder. Wait, she whispered, squinting slightly, is that Talia Pierce? I glanced back at Talia, who had been standing respectfully off to the side, letting the moment belong to Noelle and me. She met my gaze with the kind of smile that asked permission even when she didn't need to. Noelle looked back and forth between us, her brows slowly rising. You're dating that Talia? She whispered, half in awe. Talia walked toward us now, composed and radiant but unpretentious. She held out her hand first. Hi, Noelle, she said. Happy birthday. I've heard so much about you. Her voice was soft, without any hint of condescension, just warmth. That was Talia's magic. She never had to push to be accepted. She just was. Noelle hesitated for a second, then blinked as if she couldn't quite believe it. You're the magazine cover, she said, eyes wide. Like, the actual Talia Pierce. The one from the Tech Awards. Talia laughed lightly. Guilty, she said. But tonight, I'm just her dad's date. That's all. Noelle turned to me, mouth hanging open. Dad, you didn't tell me. It's not about who she is to the world, I said. It's about who she is to me. And if you're okay with it, maybe one day you'll get to know her the way I do. Noelle looked between us again, the gears clearly turning in her head. And then she stepped forward and hugged Talia. No hesitation. No performance. Just a real, quiet hug. Talia returned it gently, her hand resting on Noelle's back. I'm glad you're here, Noelle said. Really? Behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of Helene's heels clicking hard across the marble floor, her attempt to reclaim the spotlight. Noelle, sweetie, she said, voice over-sweetened. Don't you want to finish greeting the guests before dessert? You know how much work we put into the timing. Noelle turned toward her mother slowly. You mean you and Martin, she said evenly. I didn't even get to help plan this. Helene flinched, but only slightly. You approved the guest list. Noelle crossed her arms. Yeah, but I never said Dad couldn't bring someone. That was Martin's rule. And your silence. There it was. The moment of choosing. The invisible thread that always held her in the middle, suddenly snapping. She wasn't picking sides out of spite. She was picking truth. And Helene wasn't prepared for it. Noelle reached out for my hand again and smiled. Come sit with me? I saved a seat. I looked at Helene, who blinked like she'd been slapped with a cold cloth, then at Martin, whose expression had curdled into something more bitter than embarrassed. He stepped forward, all false charm. "Noel, maybe your father and his guest would feel more comfortable in the rear lounge. There's more privacy. You mean the section by the coat check?" Noel cut in. "No thanks." She turned back to me. "Please." "Of course," I said. "Lead the way." As we walked past the crowd, I didn't need to look back to know what they were thinking. The narrative had shifted, not because Talia had money or power, and not because I'd spoken up, but because the person who mattered most in that room, my daughter, chose me. Martin Vexley was a man who lived by scripts. He rehearsed everything from how long to hold a handshake to which names to drop when discussing investments at fundraisers. He liked to believe he was the smartest man in every room, especially this one. But tonight, that script was failing him. And for someone who controlled narratives like leashes, the unraveling was starting to show around the seams of his carefully curated charm. Noel leading me through the crowd like a lighthouse in a fog didn't just upset Martin's plan, it shattered it. We were supposed to be accessories tonight, side notes in a story he thought he was writing. I was the ex-husband who wasn't supposed to stand out, and Talia was supposed to be a scandal, not an asset. But there we were, moving to the main table, where only the inner circles sat, and where I had never once been offered a seat in years of shared birthdays, school banquets, and milestone events. My daughter's hand in mine was all the invitation I needed. Martin intercepted us just a few feet from the table. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His tone, though wrapped in sweetness, had that surgical edge I knew all too well. "Noel, sweetie," he said, voice laced with that practiced patience, "maybe your father should spend time with some of the guests in the rear lounge. I believe there's a quieter section just past the catering setup." I stopped. My daughter's hand tensed in mine. There it was, the familiar tactic. Wrap the insult in silk, throw it like a gift. Martin hadn't changed his methods, just the setting. He wasn't even looking at me now, just above me, past me, as if I was a stool in the way of his performance. I tilted my head slightly, a calm smile playing at my mouth. "You mean the section next to the coat check?" I asked, my voice level but direct. "Is that where you think I belong? Where the help waits out of sight?" Martin flinched, just slightly, but enough for anyone watching closely to notice. The chatter in the background quieted, like the room had leaned in. Talia stepped forward then, not loudly, not dramatically, just present. Her presence didn't need theatrics. She turned her gaze to Martin, cool and unreadable. "You know, Martin, I remember when you emailed my office 3 times asking to be considered for Linares Advisory Board. What was it you wrote? Something about your unique insight into scalable influence?" She said it like she was quoting a recipe, flat and unimpressed. "You didn't even get a courtesy rejection, did you?" Martin's face reddened immediately, and a few guests nearby tried to pretend they weren't hanging onto every syllable. That's when Jerome Nash stepped into the frame. Tall, dignified, his salt and pepper beard trimmed with mathematical precision, Jerome was Noel's godfather and one of the few men who commanded quiet without raising his voice. A seasoned political strategist, he knew the art of timing, and he had been watching the drama unfold with interest and growing disdain. "Martin," he said, calm and low but with the kind of weight that made people straighten their posture. "You're embarrassing yourself." Again, Martin turned toward him, jaw already clenching into a defensive angle. "Jerome, I was just trying to redirect," Jerome finished for him. "Like you always do. But here's the thing about control, Martin. It works best when the people around you don't know they're being manipulated. Unfortunately for you, everyone in this room just watched it happen in real time." Helene, standing a few feet back, opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked like a woman trying to put out a fire with perfume. Jerome nodded toward me, then looked at Noel. "You asked your father to come. You wanted him here. That should be the only thing that matters tonight." Noel's voice, clear and unshaking, followed close behind. "It is the only thing that matters." The silence that followed had weight. It settled on the people nearest the main table and stretched outward in ripples. For once, no one rushed to break it. No one stepped in to smooth things over. They just stood there, confronted with the truth laid bare in front of them. Martin's grip on the night, on this illusion he'd helped Helene build, was slipping, and he knew it. "I'm not asking for permission to sit with my daughter," I said finally. "I'm just following her lead." "That's what being a father looks like." Martin turned, tried to laugh it off, to regain his footing. Of course, of course. I didn't mean anything by it. Just didn't want to overcrowd the front. Logistics, you know. No need to explain, I replied. Everyone heard exactly what you meant. Talia slipped her hand into the crook of my elbow again, silent but firm. Jerome gave me a look that didn't need words. You stood your ground, and you did it with grace. As we approached the main table again, one of the servers stepped forward. Mr. Vexley, he said, a bit too loudly, should we reset the place settings to accommodate Mr. and Miss Pierce? Martin paused. He hesitated long enough that the answer became irrelevant. No, I said gently, motioning to the table beside it. We're more comfortable over there. With the real people. Jerome chuckled, out loud this time. A few others followed. Not mocking laughter. Just the kind that happens when the balloon finally pops and the air comes rushing back into the room. We sat. Noelle beside me. Talia on my left. A few of Noelle's friends came over, and to my surprise, so did a couple of parents, people who, just hours earlier, wouldn't have made eye contact with me unless they needed to borrow a phone charger. Someone passed a bottle of champagne. Someone else said, well, this just got interesting. Martin didn't approach us again. Helene stayed frozen, hands clutching her glass like it was the only thing tethering her to the room. The night rolled on, but the tone had changed. And Martin? Martin watched from across the ballroom as his carefully built house of cards fluttered to the floor, because the foundation had never been his to begin with. The spotlight wasn't literal at first. It wasn't a beam from above or a stage light flicked on for effect. It was more insidious than that. It started with glances. The kind that linger just a second too long. The kind that say, I thought I knew who you were, but now I'm not so sure. People watched me differently now, not with dismissal, not with casual pity, but with curiosity, unease. They were recalculating. Because when people build a story about you in their heads, they get rattled when you refuse to stay on script. I noticed Vivian approaching before she said a word. She wore an emerald dress with shoulder pads sharp enough to slice, and the kind of heels that were meant to declare something more than style. Power, maybe. She'd been one of Helene's favorites over the years, a confidant, a strategist, the type of woman who always spoke just loud enough for things to be overheard. She was polished and cruel when she wanted to be. Wow, she said, taking a step closer to our table. Talia Pierce. Quite the surprise tonight. Her voice was buttered with false sweetness. She didn't look at me. She looked at Talia, like she was trying to figure out what the catch was. Like it didn't make sense that someone like her would be with someone like me. Talia gave a faint smile. It's been a lovely evening. Vivian's smile turned razor-edged. Didn't you say he was working nights at a call center? She asked suddenly, turning toward Helene, loud enough for the people at nearby tables to hear. Or was it something more creative, freelance logistics? Helene froze mid-sip. A few heads turned sharply. That's the thing about cruelty, it's never as quiet as the one saying it thinks it is. Talia didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She didn't get defensive. Her voice was silk-wrapped in steel. Oh, Helene told you that? She asked, feigning mild curiosity. Odd. Because he's currently consulting for 3 Fortune 100 companies, including mine. Vivian's smile faltered. Not cracked. Collapsed. Her chin dipped just slightly, and I watched her swallow whatever remark she'd been planning to launch next. Helene turned pale, the kind of pale that comes not from embarrassment, but from exposure. All the months of her whisper campaign, the little comments meant to frame me as barely scraping by, they unraveled in a single sentence. I sat back in my chair and watched it all without needing to say a word. That was the power in truth. It didn't need an audience. It just needed one clean moment to stand in the light. Talia looked at me then, and in that look, I saw something that anchored me. Not pride, not smugness, but confirmation. She'd known this would happen, that truth, real and earned, has a weight nothing else can fake. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. Not as someone who had survived my past, but as someone who had risen because of it. Vivian excused herself with a muttered, "Excuse me," disappearing into the crowd like smoke looking for a vent. Helene didn't move. She stood rooted by the dessert table, her hand gripping a napkin like she could wring dignity out of it. The helium from the event had finally deflated. There was no salvaging what had slipped through her fingers. And yet, even in that chaos, the evening didn't feel like revenge. It felt like correction. I turned to Noelle, who'd been quiet through it all. Her eyes weren't wide with shock. They were steady. She'd been listening, watching. learning. And I realized then, this night wasn't just about restoring my place. It was about showing my daughter what truth looked like when it didn't hide. Dad, she said softly, I didn't know you were doing all that. The consulting stuff. I didn't bring it up, I said. Didn't think I needed to. Talia leaned in. Sometimes people assume silence means weakness. But your dad doesn't need to brag to prove his worth. Noelle nodded slowly, then smiled. That's actually kind of cool. She didn't mean it in the flippant way teenagers sometimes use that word. She meant it in the way that acknowledges something had just shifted. That maybe the version of me she'd been sold, by Helene, by Martin, by the curated silence of their house, was never the real one. And now that she'd seen behind the curtain, she wasn't about to forget. A woman I vaguely recognized, one of the board members from the school's foundation, approached next. She offered a smile, a compliment, and asked about consulting. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible. I was sought out. A curiosity turned asset. People who hadn't returned my emails 2 years ago were now asking for meetings, casually dropping their industries to see if I'd bite. But I didn't. I wasn't here for them. I looked across the room and saw Martin, his posture stiff, his expression carved from discomfort. He was leaning against a column, fiddling with his watch, trying to pretend like this wasn't happening all around him. But he knew. His grip on the narrative had slipped. Not because of a scandal or a fight, but because truth had found its way in and refused to leave. The spotlight wasn't about fame or dominance. It was about clarity. And it was mine now. Talia leaned toward me again. You okay? She whispered. I nodded. More than okay. Because in a room full of people who had underestimated me, I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. And nothing was louder than the silence of people realizing they were wrong about you all along. I don't think anyone expected her to speak. Noelle had always been observant, the kind of teenager who soaked up everything but rarely poured herself out in return. At school recitals or fundraisers, she stood just enough in the spotlight to be noticed, never enough to be vulnerable. But tonight, something shifted in her. Maybe it was the silence that had followed Talia's correction of Vivian. Maybe it was the embarrassment forming like frost across her mother's face. Or maybe it was the way so many people had tried to talk around her, about her, but never to her. Whatever it was, she stood up. It was quiet at our table, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with expectation. I could feel the hum of the room recalibrating as more people realized that the girl in the birthday tiara was no longer just the center of the decorations, but the center of the moment. Noelle placed her napkin down slowly and rose from her chair, straightening her shoulders as if bracing herself for an invisible gust. Her hands trembled just a little, but her voice didn't when she opened her mouth. Can we stop pretending? The sentence landed like a dropped plate in a cathedral. Everything halted. Forks stopped midway to lips. Whispers fell off cliffs. Even the pianist in the far corner missed his cue. She scanned the room, not with anger, but with a clarity far beyond her years. I know what's been said about my dad. I know the jokes, the stories, the way people here treat him like he's just background. She paused, swallowing hard. I could see her working through the fear, pushing through it with every word. But he's done more for me than anyone in this room. He didn't abandon me. He didn't check out. He didn't replace me with a new career or a different family. Her voice caught briefly, but she steadied herself and continued, louder now. He showed up, quietly, every time, even when he wasn't welcome, even when people made sure he felt small. He still came. I could feel something in my chest pull tight, like a thread of emotion too deep to name. Noelle had always been perceptive, but this was bravery. She wasn't just defending me. She was reclaiming something for herself, too. She turned slowly, her gaze falling on Helene. You told me he wasn't our kind anymore. You said he wouldn't understand the world I'd be growing into. But maybe what you really meant was that you were scared he'd find someone better. Gasps rippled across the crowd, quiet and sharp. Helene's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. For once, she didn't have a response ready. No rebuttal. No polished narrative. Just the hollow echo of her daughter's truth ringing in her ears. Noelle looked back at me, her eyes misty but clear. And he did. He found someone better. Someone who treats him like he matters. Like he isn't just a mistake she regrets, but a man worth choosing. Talia looked stunned, but not in the way most people would expect. It wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was something quieter. A deep, quiet respect. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand on mine, as if anchoring me in the moment. And then, as if to cap it off, Noelle said something I'll never forget. I don't care who owns the building or who's wearing what or which magazine someone was in last month. What matters to me is who shows up, who tells the truth, who listens. She took a breath, her voice soft now. And that's my dad. The room remained frozen in place. No one clapped. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to wait. Because when a 16-year-old girl stands in front of a room full of adults and tells them they've had it wrong all along, applause isn't the right response. Reflection is. Helene sat down slowly, her body stiff, her face unreadable. Martin stared at the floor, jaw clenched so tightly I half expected it to crack. Vivian pretended to fix her bracelet. No one looked directly at us. Not yet. They were still processing what had just happened. Noelle turned, walked back to her seat, and sat beside me again. She didn't look for approval. She didn't need it. She had said her piece, and in doing so, carved a new place for herself in the story they had all tried to write without her. I leaned in close. You didn't have to do that, I whispered. I know, she said, but I wanted to. Talia smiled at her. That was brave. I was just tired, Noelle said, reaching for her drink. Tired of pretending this party was about anything else. The silence eventually broke, but not with more accusations or fake smiles. This time, it came with adjustments. People who had ignored us all evening began to offer nods, not performative ones, but genuine. A few even came over to say hello. One of Noelle's teachers whispered, "She's got your courage." And for the first time, I believed it. The lighting in the ballroom hadn't changed, but everything else had. The air was different. The hierarchy had shifted. And not because of wealth, or name, or power, but because the youngest person in the room spoke the loudest truth. Noelle didn't need to win anyone over. She wasn't looking to elevate me or embarrass her mother. She simply told the truth. And it did what truth always does when it's spoken without fear. It echoed. The strange thing about reclaiming something you were pushed out of is that when you finally stand back in it, you realize how much smaller it always was than the power they made you think it held. This party, this ballroom, these people, it had all felt like a wall for years. A wall built by wealth, old gossip, whispered judgments, and closed-door invitations. But standing beside Talia, with Noelle's hands still loosely wrapped around mine, I could see it for what it truly was. A stage set up by people too afraid of the truth to live in it. We didn't have to make a scene anymore. We didn't have to defend anything. That moment had passed. The energy had shifted completely. And when Helene stood and gestured toward the head table again, attempting to smooth over the evening with what I'm sure she thought was grace, it felt like someone reading the end of a chapter they no longer had the authority to close. "You can join us at the front table now," she said, voice just loud enough for others to hear. "You're welcome, of course." I looked at the table she pointed to, the one I had never been invited to during Noelle's elementary recitals, school galas, or birthdays past. It was a throne disguised as hospitality. A symbolic offering made too late, after too much had been said and too little had been owned. I looked at Helene's face, polished and tense, waiting for me to say yes and complete the illusion that we were all still playing by her rules. "No, thank you," I said, my voice calm and without malice. "We're more comfortable over there, with the real people." A few gasps echoed softly behind napkins. Talia didn't flinch. Noelle cracked the faintest grin. Jerome Nash, seated a few tables back, let out an audible chuckle and raised his glass halfway toward me in silent approval. The head table, with its crystal centerpieces and carefully placed name cards, suddenly looked like the loneliest place in the room. Someone passed around a bottle of champagne, an actual one this time, not the pre-poured flutes floating around on trays. The cork popped, laughter followed, and someone slid a second glass toward Talia. She accepted it with an elegant nod and turned to me. I raised mine, not in toast to the night, but to her. To the woman who didn't rescue me but reminded me I was never drowning. To the woman who stood beside me when I had every reason to walk away quietly. To the woman who made it impossible for me to stay small. She clinked her glass against mine. To finally being seen. "No," I said, holding her gaze. To never needing permission again. And just like that, we didn't need to win the room. We didn't need to conquer it. We simply existed in it, without apology, without performance. We became the still point in the chaos, and people noticed. Conversations resumed, but they were different now. People weren't looking at us with confusion or suspicion. They were watching like students who had just realized the lesson wasn't coming from the teacher in front of them, but from the back of the room where the real knowledge sat in silence. I watched Helene sit slowly, her smile holding but her shoulders sagging. Martin whispered something to her, likely trying to regroup, but she didn't respond. Not immediately. For the first time in a long time, Helene didn't look victorious. She looked tired. Tired of spinning, tired of pretending, tired of watching the house she built on exclusion crumble in front of everyone she meant to impress. We didn't go back to the spotlight. We didn't need to. We stayed at the corner table, close to the dessert station, where Noelle could laugh freely with her friends, and I could hold Talia's hand without pretense. A few people stopped by to greet us, sincerely this time. A school counselor I hadn't seen in years told me Noelle's maturity tonight had moved her. A man I used to sit behind in soccer bleachers finally asked what I actually did for work. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Helene eventually approached again near the end of the night, but this time without performance. There was no host smile, no matriarchal posture. Just a woman standing in the uncomfortable shadow of her own decisions. "She's grown up a lot," she said quietly, watching Noelle help a younger cousin unwrap a birthday favor. "She's had to," I said. "She learned by watching." Helene nodded slowly, the weight of that truth registering in her eyes. "I didn't expect tonight to go like this." "No one ever does," I replied. "That's the thing about the truth. It doesn't ask for an invitation." She didn't apologize. Not really. But maybe this version of her, this quieter, smaller, uncertain version, was the closest she'd ever come. "She loves you," she said finally. "I know," I replied. "Because I show up. That's the only currency that matters to her." She walked away after that. Not defeated, not humiliated, just stripped of the story she'd clung to. And I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. That was enough. When the music slowed, and people began to gather coats and gifts, Noelle came over and leaned her head on my shoulder. "Thank you for not letting them keep me from you," she whispered. "They couldn't if they tried," I said, wrapping my arm around her. "You're mine." "And hers too," she added, nodding toward Talia. Talia smiled from across the table, glass still in hand. I soughed. "Only if you'll have me," she said gently. Noelle nodded. "I already do." As we prepared to leave, the valet approached us inside, holding out 2 sets of keys, one for the Civic, one for the Bentley. "Which one, sir?" he asked. I looked at Talia. She smirked, already knowing what I was thinking. "Tonight," she said, slipping on her coat. "The Civic. Keep the Bentley for headlines." And we stepped back out into the night, not to prove anything, not to perform, but because it felt good to walk in the rain and know exactly who was walking beside you. The air outside smelled of lavender and rain. That blend of something expensive and something honest. The kind of scent that didn't belong to the venue but had somehow found its way into the night anyway. Talia walked beside me, coat draped over her arm, her heels tapping a rhythm that felt like punctuation to a sentence we'd finally finished. Noelle was in front of us, laughing with one of her friends, her birthday sash slightly askew, tiara a little crooked now. She looked lighter, freer. Like someone who had been waiting to exhale for years and finally did. The valet pulled the Civic up slowly, probably hoping we'd change our minds. The Bentley sat in the glow of the covered entrance, its matte finish gleaming under the soft downpour, like a parked promise of prestige. But I didn't look at it twice. The Civic was mine. Scratch bumper, faint smell of old pine air freshener, and all. It was the car that had driven Noelle to school the first time Helene forgot. The car I'd driven through sleepless nights when consulting jobs barely paid enough for groceries. It wasn't about pride. It was about history. Some vehicles carry more than mileage, they carry proof. As the valet opened the door, Talia gave him a polite nod. "Thanks," she said. Then she looked at me, her voice lower. "Just for us. You really don't want the Bentley tonight?" I shook my head. "No. The Civic feels truer." She smiled. "That's why I love you." Noelle slid into the back seat without complaint, tucking her dress in carefully, clutching the gift bag she'd been handed on the way out. I settled into the driver's seat, Talia beside me. The rain whispered on the windshield as I started the engine. The soft hum of the heater kicked in, warming the space, pulling us together like a cocoon. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Noelle was watching me, and for once, she didn't look like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She just looked safe. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything," I said, eyes on the road but heart tuned entirely to her. I think I know what I want to do for college. That caught my attention. Noelle had been dodging the subject for months. Every time Helene or Martin brought it up, she changed the topic, said she needed time, said it felt too far away. But tonight, she sounded certain. Rooted. I want to study business, she said. But I want to build something real. Not just make money. Something that matters. Talia turned slightly in her seat. Any school in mind? I was looking at Emerson, Noelle said. They have a program in social entrepreneurship. It's not the flashiest school, but it feels like me. Sounds like a great fit, I said. She hesitated. And I want to do it on my own. No favors. No strings. I've seen what those do to people. I nodded. Proud didn't even begin to cover it. She had seen more truth in 16 years than most people see in 60. And somehow, she had emerged with clarity instead of bitterness. Talia looked back at her. You'll be better than both of us. You already are. That made Noelle blush, and she looked out the window to hide it. But I saw the way her shoulders lifted slightly, the way her chin tilted up. She believed it, or at least she was starting to. That mattered more than anything. The rest of the ride was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand to be filled. We passed through downtown, the lights glowing in puddles on the street, the city softened by the rain. I thought about the past, about the man I was when Helene and I first split, when Martin entered the picture, when Noelle started pulling back and I didn't know how to reach her. I'd spent so long trying to be acceptable, palatable, small enough to fit in their world. But the truth was, I'd never belonged in it, because it wasn't built for truth. It was built for image. And yet here we were, Talia's hand resting gently on my knee, Noelle humming softly in the back seat, and me finally understanding that sometimes the thing they try to keep you out of isn't worth getting back into. Because it was never about re-entry. It was about reclamation. We dropped Noelle off first. She hugged Talia before she hugged me, which surprised me, but in the best possible. We waited until she got inside, waved once more through the glass. Then I pulled away, slower this time. Not because I needed to delay the drive, but because I didn't want the night to end too quickly. Talia leaned back in her seat, watching me with that half-smile she always wore when she was reading me like a favorite book. What are you thinking? She asked. This, I said, gesturing to the road, to the space between us, to the world we'd just walked through and survived. This is what it feels like to finally write your own story. She nodded. And now I don't need to be invited anywhere, I said, because I know who I am. She leaned over, rested her head on my shoulder at the next red light. That's why I said yes. Yes to what? I asked, glancing at her. To being your +1, she whispered. Not just tonight. For everything. And in that moment, under the rain, with the world finally quiet and the last lie behind us, I realized something simple and staggering. Of all the people in that ballroom, of all the names and suits and stage smiles, I had walked out with the only two people who truly saw me. Noelle, my heart, and Talia, my choice. They didn't need me to prove anything. They just needed me to show up. And I always would.